Authentication is really important if you want to have proper API security. Instead of implementing something yourself, you should consider using an external identity provider, and a popular choice is Google's Firebase Authentication service. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to integrate Firebase Authentication with a .NET 7 API. Firebase is Google's cloud platform that offers a number of services that could be useful for developing modern applications, such as hosting for static web apps, running cloud functions, which you can run on demand. It's very similar to Azure Functions. Then there is Cloud Firestore, which is a real-time NoSQL database running in the cloud, and the service that we are interested in, and that is Firebase Authentication. We're going to use it as an external identity provider to implement JSON Web Token authentication, but first we need to set up a Firebase project. In order to get started with Firebase Authentication, we first have to create a new project. You can just enter a name for your project, and then you can click Continue. You can choose if you want to enable Firebase Analytics. I'm not going to use this. And then you just create your project. It's going to take a moment or two for your project to be created, and I'm going to use the one I created earlier for the actual implementation. So let's see what we have inside. Once we are inside of our project, we want to navigate to Authentication, and here you can see some test users that I created already. Then it's really important to enable at least one sign-in method. I'm going to use email and password for the purposes of this video, but out of the box, Firebase supports many other authentication providers, such as using Google, Facebook, Microsoft, and Twitter as your identity providers. However, we're going to use email and password just to make things simple. One more thing that you will need from your Firebase project is when you go into your project settings, we're going to need two things from this page. One is going to be the Web API key, which we are going to use to generate a JSON Web Token using the Firebase REST API. And the second thing is a service account so that we can integrate with our Firebase Admin SDK. It's just a package that is available in .NET, and you'll need to generate at least one service account configuration by clicking Generate New Private Key. This is going to give you a JSON file containing your service account credentials. I already created one, and I'm going to show you what it looks like a bit later into the video. Now let's move into the implementation and see how we can integrate Firebase with our .NET API. I'm going to update the use case for creating a new customer in the eShop system to also register this customer with Firebase Authentication, and then we're going to use the external identity provider to authenticate this user with our system. So let's get started by creating a folder inside of the abstractions folder, which I will call authentication. I'm going to add one service inside, which is just going to be an interface, and I'm going to call it authentication service. Inside of this interface, I want to expose one method, returning back a string. The string is going to represent the ID of this user in the Firebase system. Let's call this method register async. It's going to accept two arguments, which are going to be an email and a password. We're going to pass them from the create customer command to the authentication service. Let's start by updating the create customer command to also include a password. And because we are actually registering a new customer, let's rename our entire command to match the use case that we are implementing. This is now going to be the register customer request, and I'm also going to rename the handler to represent what I'm actually doing. So this is going to be the register customer command handler. I'm also going to clean up the command validator. So this will be the register customer command validator. Now I also need to update my use case name to say register instead of create. And I'm going to apply a refactoring to adjust the namespace of this folder so that it properly says register instead of create. Now I can continue with my implementation. So let's start by injecting the authentication service, which I just defined, and let's inject it from the constructor. So I'll say authentication service, and we can assign our authentication service private field. Now I need to decide when I'm going to call this service to register the customer with Firebase. In any case, you will have to implement a check to see if this email is available both in our database and also in Firebase, but I'm going to leave that part up to you. I'm just going to focus on registering the user with Firebase. So let's say we get back an identity ID by calling authentication service register async. And let's pass in the request email and request password to this method. Assuming this completed successfully, we're going to get back the identity ID of this user in the Firebase system. So we're also going to need to pass this value to the customer constructor so that we can store this field in the database. So I'm going to add this field to the constructor, and I'm going to expand the constructor to include another argument. Now in the customer entity, this field isn't assigned to anything, so let's create a read-only property. We're going to need a new database migration to create this column, and then we can use it with the customer. Now let's see how we're going to actually implement the authentication service and connect it with Firebase. I'm going to add the implementation in the infrastructure project, which is currently pretty empty. So let's start by adding a new folder, which I will call authentication, and I'm going to create my authentication service inside of this folder. Now let's make this class internal and sealed, and I'm going to implement my authentication service. I'll need to add a reference to the application project to be able to see this interface, and now I can implement the missing members. So currently this is just the register async method, and I'm going to use Firebase to register this user with Firebase Authentication. I need to start by installing the NuGet package for the Firebase Admin SDK. It's called Firebase Admin, and the latest version is 2.4.0 at the time of recording this video. So what does this NuGet package give me? This NuGet package gives me access to the Firebase auth class, which I can use to get the default Firebase auth instance, and I can call the create user async method on this Firebase auth instance. This method expects a user arguments object, so let's go ahead and create it. So user arguments is a new user record args, and we're just going to set the email and the password on this object. You can also set some other values, such as if the user is disabled or not. You can also set the email verified to true or false. By default, it's going to be unverified, and let's just pass in the email and password, and we're going to pass this object to our method. Of course, I need to await it, and it's going to return a user record instance if I manage to create this user successfully. Now I can use the user record that I got back from Firebase to return the user ID of this user in the Firebase system. As you can see, this is really straightforward. It's only a few lines of code to integrate with Firebase, and we also need to configure our Firebase SDK to be able to connect to our Firebase project. And how we're going to do that is in our dependency injection class, or rather the add infrastructure method. I'm going to add some code to configure Firebase. So you need to call the Firebase app class, and it has a create method where you need to pass in the service account details that you got from the Firebase console. So how am I going to do that? I'll create a new app options instance, and I'll pass it to this method, and I'm going to assign the credential property by saying Google credential, and I'm going to take it from a file. The file is going to be called Firebase JSON, and this is actually my Firebase service account that I got from the Firebase console. The service account file is available in my web API project, and here's what it looks like. It contains a bunch of details required for Firebase to authenticate your project, mainly the client ID, the private key that's used to sign your JSON web tokens, and so on. You can also provide these details through an environment variable and a few other options. This is the simplest one, so that's what I'm going to use. As far as the customer is concerned, it's definitely worthwhile to update your EF core configuration and include a unique index on the identity ID column. This is going to speed up your queries when searching for the customer based on the identity ID. Before I can create my migration, we also need to register the authentication service with dependency injection. So I'm going to say services, add singleton, and I'll create my authentication service as the authentication service implementation, which we just added in the infrastructure project. Now I'll create my database migration and run the project. Here's my post request for creating a new customer. And I'm also noting that the minimum required length for the password with Firebase is 6 characters. So that's just something you need to be aware of. And now I'm going to send this request to our API. I hit the breakpoint inside of the register customer command handler. And let's go into the authentication service to see what's going to happen when we try to call create user async using the Firebase SDK. So I created the user arguments, and now I'm trying to create a user. You can see that this successfully completes, and we get back a user record with some Firebase generated ID that we are going to store in our own database. So let's go ahead and complete our handler for the register customer command. We create a new customer and we give it the identity ID. We add it to the repository, and after I exit from this method, we have successfully registered our customer with our system and also the external identity provider. Now you know how to register a user using Firebase, but how do you get a JSON web token that you can use to authenticate this user? Let's create a use case for logging in a customer and obtaining a JSON web token. So I'll create the login feature, and let's add the login command class. So I'm actually going to use a record like I usually do for defining my commands, and I'm going to need the email and password to be able to authenticate this user with Firebase. I'm going to make this an I command, and we need to return some sort of response that's going to contain the JSON web token that was generated using Firebase. The simplest implementation can be returning just the raw string, or you can create some type that you're going to return from this command. I like making things simple because this is just an example, and I'm going to return a string from my login command. Now let's implement the login command handler. So login command handler, I'll make it internal and sealed, and it's going to implement I request handler from mediator. It's going to handle the login command and return a string representing the JSON web token. So let's make this async. And what do we have to do here? Well, I need to somehow call Firebase and get back a JSON web token that I can return from this method. Unfortunately, the Firebase SDK doesn't expose a method which you can pass an email and password and get back a JSON web token. So we'll have to use a different approach, and we're going to use the Firebase REST API to obtain a valid JSON web token. So what I'm going to do is define another service inside of the authentication folder, which I will call JWT provider. And let's actually make this a class and not an interface. It's going to have one method returning a string. Let's give this method a name, get for credentials async. So it's going to accept the email and password, which we're going to pass from our command, and let's use it inside of the login command handler. So this is going to be the private read-only JWT provider, and let's inject it from the constructor. Now our handle method is just going to be a simple wrapper around this service. We're going to pass the email and password to the get for credentials async method. Of course, you should be handling the case when the user is not authenticated, but I'm just going to focus on the happy path to keep things simple. So let's implement this service inside of the infrastructure project, and I'm going to add a class right next to our authentication service. So this is going to be the JWT provider. It's going to be internal and sealed, and I'm going to implement the respective interface. Now I'm going to implement this as a typed HTTP client, and I'm going to inject an HTTP client instance from the constructor. So let's generate the constructor. My implementation is pretty straightforward. It's just going to send a post request to the respective endpoint for obtaining a JSON web token, and we're going to return the response from this method. So let's create the request object that we're going to need to pass to this method. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to say that the request is an anonymous object, which I'm going to send as a JSON payload to the post endpoint. It needs to accept the email and the password, and you should also set the return secure token value to true. Now I'm going to say response is equal, and I'm going to call HTTP client post as JSON async. I first need to specify my route, which is going to be an empty string because I'm going to configure this in my HTTP client configuration, and I'm going to pass it the request, which is our anonymous object. Now this is going to return an access token response, and I'm going to need to parse this from the response content. I'm going to add a nested class, which is going to represent my authentication token that's going to be returned from this method, and I'm going to get this token by saying response, or rather await response content read from JSON async, and specify authentication token as the type. And now I can just return authentication token ID token from this method. Of course, this could return a 400 bad request or a 401 unauthorized, and you need to handle those cases, but as I said, I'm just going to focus on the happy path. We also need to register our HTTP client with dependency injection, but if I go ahead and try to do that by saying services add HTTP client, I'll see that this method is missing. So I need to add a respective NuGet package, and I'm going to search for HTTP, and I'm going to install Microsoft extensions HTTP. So let's go ahead and install this NuGet package. And now the add HTTP client method is available. So how do we register a typed client? Well, we specify what is our typed interface, which is the JWT provider, and then we specify the implementation. This is going to register our service as a transient service, so beware of any scope dependencies because those are not going to work. I also want to configure my HTTP client to set the base address, which is going to point to the respective route where the endpoint is for getting a JSON Web Token from the Firebase RESTful API. Ideally, you want to pull this value from your application settings, so I'm going to use an overload, which accepts a delegate with a service provider and the HTTP client, so that I can say var configuration, and I can access the service provider and get the iConfiguration service. So let me find it. And now I can use my configuration instance to obtain a new URI. The value is going to come from our iConfiguration instance, and I'm going to give it this path in our application settings. For the actual value, here's what I'm going to do. Let's go to the app settings development JSON, and let's create the authentication section. Inside of it, I'm going to create a new value, which is the token URI, and this is the value of the token URI. So you need to hit the Identity Toolkit googleapis.com route, and this is the endpoint giving you back the JSON Web Token. And the important thing is you're going to have to specify your Web API key, which I mentioned at the start of the video in the project settings in the Firebase console. With the API key in place, this endpoint is going to return a proper response. So let's also define a new endpoint in the customer routes, and let's make it a post endpoint. So map post, let's give it a name of login, and I need something to represent my request body. I'm just going to use something simple, and I'm actually going to specify the entire login command. So this is going to be my command instance, and then I'm going to need the iSender from mediator to be able to send this command. So if all goes well, I can just say return results.ok, and I can say await sender send and pass in the command instance. So this is just going to send my login command and give me back the JSON Web Token. Here's the post endpoint for logging in our user. I specified the email and password that we used earlier when registering this customer, and if I hit send, we're going to get back a JSON Web Token that was generated using the Firebase RESTful API. Let's examine this token and see what we have inside. If I paste the JSON Web Token that we just received into the JWT.io website, we can see what we have inside of the token. Now I'm mainly interested in the payload, where you can see the issuer the audience, which is our Firebase project ID. There's also the subject claim containing the user identifier in the Firebase system, but we're also storing it in our database so that we can identify this user. You can also see the user's email, if the email was verified or not, and so on. So now all that's left to do is to figure out how to use this JSON Web Token to authenticate with our API. The last step is to configure JSON Web Token authentication for our API. So I'm going to start by adding a NuGet package in the infrastructure project, and I'm going to install Microsoft ASP.NET Core Authentication JWT Bearer. So let's go ahead and install this NuGet package. And what this allows me to do is to add authentication to my services. So I'll say services, add authentication, and I'm going to chain a call to add JWT Bearer. Now I can also configure my authentication scheme on this method, and I'm going to say JWT Bearer defaults, and I'll pass the authentication scheme, which is going to be just the bearer token scheme. I can also pass in an action that will configure my JSON Web Token bearer options. This is going to allow us to configure some values required for authentication, and for this purpose I'm going to expand the arguments list to also give me an configuration instance so that it's easier for me to grab values from my application configuration. I'll also rename this variable so that it doesn't conflict with my configuration argument, and here I'm going to say JWT options audience, and it's going to come from configuration authentication audience. Then I'm going to say JWT options token validation parameters, and I'm going to set the valid issuer to the value that's going to come from our application settings. So let me just copy this, and the value is going to be authentication valid issuer. These two values are going to live inside of my application settings. The audience will be our project ID, and the valid issuer will be the same one that was present in the JSON Web Token. A few more things that we need to wire up is the authentication middleware. You will have to say app use authentication and also app use authorization. Make sure not to mix these up, and I also need to pass builder configuration to the add infrastructure method. I also need to enforce authentication for some endpoints, and for example, let's use the products endpoints. I'm just going to add an example to the get products endpoint, and I'm going to say require authorization, which is the same thing as adding the authorized attribute to a controller endpoint or the entire controller. Before I run the project, I also need to add one more configuration value that I forgot earlier, and that is setting the authority on the JSON Web Token options to the same value that we are using as the valid issuer. This is important so that the authentication middleware can use this endpoint to obtain a public key to verify the JSON Web Token that we are using to authenticate with the API. So with this in place, we should have everything we need to have authentication working. So let's see if that is the case. I'm going to send an unauthenticated request from Postman to our API endpoint, and as expected, we get back a 401 unauthorized response. I'm going to use the JSON Web Token that I get in my login endpoint and pass it to the bearer token authorization header. And now let's try to send this same request to our API, and let's observe what's going to happen. So this time the authentication takes a moment, but we get back a response containing our list of products. If I send this again, the authentication should work a bit faster, and we have our JSON Web Token authentication working correctly using Firebase. If you enjoyed this video about integrating Firebase authentication with a .NET API, then make sure to subscribe to my channel, take a look at this video next, and until next time, stay awesome.